So let's kick things off. Supercharge your threat modeling with software supply chain security. That is the talk that we're having today. And again, my name is Paul Roberts. I am the cyber content lead here at ReversingLabs. Sorry. Go ahead. And I'm going to, before we get going, let's understand a little bit more about ReversingLabs and who we are. And I'm going to pass the mic to my colleague, Josh Knox, who is going to run it down.
Yeah, I'm just going to run down real quick a little bit about ReversingLabs. If you've never heard of us before, ReversingLabs, we do complex binary analysis, and we have the largest searchable threat repository in the field, over 40 billion samples that we've collected over the years. That's 8 times larger than our nearest competitor. And we are under the hood, I like to say, in 60 plus cybersecurity companies or tools that are out there that you would know the names if I started listing them all off. And because we are being used by so many other companies to be able to look at files, give a verdict about whether a file is good or bad, be able to analyze those files in very in-depth ways that we won't get into right now. But because of all of that, we're analyzing like 20 million files a day. That's a lot of files that we get to look at. So anyway, that's a little bit about us. We kind of know a thing or two about being able to analyze binaries and be able to tell you what's going on inside them. And so with that in mind, I'll hand it back over to Paul, and we'll jump in here today.
Okay, so first of all, let's get to know who we've got on the line. That speaking there was my colleague, Josh Knox. Josh is a senior cybersecurity technologist here at ReversingLabs, and he is an evangelist who specializes in software supply chain security, CI/CD, Kubernetes. And prior to coming on here at ReversingLabs, Knox was a principal engineer who focused on automation, application development, worked for Carbon Black, VMware, also a really expert, deeply steeped in what's going on right now with AI and machine learning. He's actually done some sessions here internally for us, kind of bringing us up to speed. So great resource for info on AI. Knox, welcome. Say hi. You already did. But...
glad to be here. Excited.
And our special guest is Chris Romeo. Chris is the co-founder and CEO of Devici. They're a threat modeling company. He's a co-author of the Threat Modeling Manifesto, which is a book that tells you how you can kind of supercharge your software risk management by adding deeper visibility, such as binary analysis-based software supply chain security with threat modeling. It's kind of some of the topics we're going to be talking about today. And he advocates a systemic and collaborative approach to mapping out how things can go wrong with software, systems, and architectures for the purpose of making sure they don't go wrong. Chris, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And I did notice that Knox gets to go by just his last name, like it's kind of like Prince, or I'm like
Romeo.
Yeah. So
we could do that for you too.
No, I'll stay with Chris. It's fine. But I'm like, it's like a famous person kind of thing, like just the last name, single name.
The artist formerly known as Josh.
I like that. Exactly. I can't wait for his next album.
All right. And Chris is the founder of Devici. Chris, tell us just a little bit about your company, Devici, and what you all do.
Yeah, so we built a new threat modeling platform. And we made it in such a way that it's simple to use, it's collaborative in nature, it has a solid knowledge base of threats and mitigations, and we have the ability to scan code and generate threat models from them. So we built this brand new platform because people just make threat modeling too hard. It needs to be simple. That's how we have success with it. And that's really what we built with Devici, is something that's simple to use and will get you really great results at thinking about what are those threats that happen that we can identify early in the design so that we don't carry them forward to production. And so that's really the vision of Devici, and that's why we do what we do.
Great. Okay, so moving on here to our conversation, and we're gonna have a good long conversation here about this important topic. To start it all off, though, I think a really important thing is maybe to just clarify what we mean and what we're talking about when we use the term threat modeling and, kind of what types of activities, controls threat modeling refers to. And, Chris, seeing as you literally wrote the book on it, I'm going to toss that question to you and ask you to sort of, just for our audience, kind of just define what we're talking about here when we say threat modeling.
Sure. Yep. Yeah, and the work you're mentioning, the Threat Modeling Manifesto, was a collaboration with 15 people total. But that actually makes it even better because we got 15 people that care a lot about threat modeling, from consulting and education and private sector and all these different folks. We came to a definition that we all could agree on. I wouldn't say we all loved it, but we all said we could agree on it. So threat modeling, according to the Threat Modeling Manifesto, is analyzing representations of a system to understand the security and privacy challenges. And so if we work our way backwards from it, security and privacy challenges are really the core of everything that can go wrong with a system. Every vulnerability in a system ultimately was a security or privacy challenge at some point in the system lifecycle. And we do that by analyzing representations, which a representation could be as simple as just a picture. I happen to love data flow diagrams because they just make sense to me, but it can be a conversation that Knox and I have, perhaps in the early evening, talking about, over an adult beverage, perhaps, we could do a threat model in that context of a conversation. What are you building, Knox? He starts to explain it to me. We start to think about what are the security and privacy challenges. Could be a diagram that's drawn, could be, there's lots of different ways you could represent, but it really comes down to what are the problems from a security and privacy perspective, and how are we going to mitigate them?
Oh, you're muted, Paul.
Of course I am. Of course I am. Just talk a little bit about sort of the distinction for companies that are doing, threat modeling versus more commonly understood activities like, red teaming, pen testing. I think some people kind of glom these things together in their head, but they're actually different. So when we talk about threat modeling versus something like red teaming, pen testing, how are they different?
Yeah, so threat modeling, think about, we're going to start this in the very early stages of coming up with an idea for something we're going to build, because you can certainly threat model something at the end of the day, at the end of the release cycle, but it's really hard to make any changes as a result of it. So threat modeling is looking at what you're building early to try and figure out what possibly could go wrong so we can change the design. Red teaming, pen testing, I think of that on the other side of the equation here, or later in the life cycle, because you have to have something built to test it. Whereas threat modeling, I can threat model an idea. Paul, you say, hey, I have this idea for this new product. We can threat model it. You can't pen test it because it's only in your brain. It isn't in code yet, right? And so red teaming and pen testing, from my perspective, is the series of steps we go through to test the security and privacy of a running piece of code. Threat modeling is something that we think about early in the process before we even have code. And so they do work together nicely. They are good controls for each other. Like, I wouldn't ever recommend somebody do just threat modeling. You don't need to pen test this thing. Pen testing is a check and balance to, did we do a good enough job with the threat model? If we didn't, and we find a bunch of problems in the pen test, we got to go back and look at our threat model process and say, why did we not see these things? Why was that not part of the results that came out of the process?
Right. And Knox, traditionally, when we've talked about threat modeling, it's really been around kind of, the traditional types of cybersecurity threats and attacks that organizations need to, be wary of or be attuned to. When we're talking about threat modeling in the context of software supply chain security, how is that different? How does that conversation change?
Well, it's different because you're dealing with usually trying to develop the software itself. And so because we're talking about software instead of talking about, command line and trying to do things in an actual environment. A lot of times we're talking about environmental vulnerabilities and things like that. But now we need to think specifically about, is this dependency vulnerable? Did I just write a piece of code that's going to leave me open to being exploited because I didn't put the correct, verification on that field and things like that, right? Like, I think I had a good friend many years ago, and it was almost annoying. Every time you would write a piece of code, he would just break it. He'd be like, oh, let me try this. Was it supposed to do that? And you would be like, well, no, what are you doing? And it's because he would just immediately try to break the code. But it was a good thing, because if he was breaking it while we were building it, then that means somebody else, there's going to be people when you release it that are doing the same thing. So it just has to, the mindset has to be different. And a lot of times the people programming and coding just want to get it to work. They're not thinking about how could it be broken.
Right. I mean, Chris, you've talked about this too, and around the kind of the state of application development, software development right now is pretty fast and loose, I guess, might be terms to describe it, particularly when it comes to integrating, open source code and using that to, speed along your application development. Of course, it's been going on for a long time. Talk about some of the current practices that you see or you hear about or observe that might, have some serious consequences when it comes to application security risk and software supply chain risk that development organizations need to be attuned to.
Yeah, I mean, specifically when we're talking about the supply chain, one of the things that I think threat modeling is very similar from both the supply chain and threat modeling anything else. The process and the steps that we go through is the same. Supply chain really introduced a different scope. And so one of the biggest challenges that I've identified recently, and it was really just by thinking about it and going, wait a second, even a team that's doing excellent threat models of what they build is not extending that back into the supply chain. So nobody threat models the components that they use. At least, I mean, if you're out there and if you're on this call, on this webinar and you do, I would love to hear, because I want to hear that story. Like I just realized that people put this inherent trust in the supply chain. And yes, you have tools like ReversingLabs to help you have a greater level of trust in the supply chain components that you're using, right? But people tend to just trust the supply chain and trust these components in such a way. And it just got me thinking, like, if you are using inside of an enterprise, you have hundreds of applications, you should have an inventory of your supply chain, of your software components you're using from open source or third party or whatever. You should threat model the top 10 of those yourself. Now, occasionally you'll find a software component that somebody has sponsored some research to do a threat model of it. There's a few of them floating around, but not many. But I just realized there's this whole vast risk/threat environment that we just don't think about in the context of the supply chain. We just kind of assume it's good. We're getting this component. It's free. It's open source. We can trust it. And I think that's part of one of the big challenges we have right now.
I think there's often like this sort of psychology where you'll look and be like, well, this is, this has so many different, so many hundreds of thousands of downloads, right? Or branches. So, somebody out there has done the thorough code audit that I don't really have the time or desire to do, but I'm just going to assume that one of these users has done this, and therefore I can trust it because somebody in that huge user population would have caught anything amiss. But as we know, not true, right?
Paul?
So yeah, go ahead, Knox.
I've started to call that the restaurant review mentality. And what I mean by that is you go and you look at a restaurant, you look at the reviews, and how old are those reviews? Are they from 2 years ago? Okay, well, that restaurant could be under new management. They got a new chef, they have a new staff, like anything. I mean, just because the reviews were good on it 6 months ago even doesn't mean that your experience is going to be the same as those other people. So I feel like I love that analogy, because we do that. We look, we're like, oh, it's got 10,000 stars on GitHub. It must be amazing, until they actually merge in the wrong pull request and merge a bunch of junk into it, and everybody's going to feel it.
That's right. Yeah. You're going to have a tummy ache. So I put up a poll for folks just to get a sense of where your top priorities are. And I understand that you may be looking at this and being like, where's the all of the above option? Because these are all, concerns, but I actually, by design, like what is your top concern? What is, if you had to pick one of these things as this is what my organization is top of mind for us right now, what is it? I think we got them all done. If you haven't taken it, take it now. I'll give you another few seconds and we will wrap it up. Yeah, no, I think I think that's a really good analogy, Knox. And, I guess, what should organizations, let's just wrap up our poll right now, just looking at these results, 50% of the folks polled said verifying the security and integrity of packages we receive from software suppliers was their top concern. 30% securing our development environment against software supply chain attacks, so software producer side. And then 20% compliance focused, right? What are your thoughts on that, Chris?
I think it holds what I was expecting. I guess I'm a little bit surprised that 20% said transparency and SBOMs, just because for me, I've been a bit of an SBOM pundit in our industry, and I don't have a problem with transparency. I love transparency. I think we built this machine before anybody was ready to drive the car. And so we've got all these cars sitting around and nobody's doing it. People are spending a lot of money building these cars and nobody wants to drive them because they don't know how to drive. They don't tell anybody how to drive, right? And so, I guess that one's a little bit surprising that 20%, but I guess there's some compliance in US
Compliance
Fed.
is compliance, right?
Yeah, you got to do it. And even if it doesn't add value, there is no value proposition in the compliance game. It's just, you got to do it.
Knox, any thoughts?
Yeah, I just talked to a customer the other day that, you see here verifying security integrity of software packages we receive from software suppliers. And they were saying they were a producer, and one of their big struggles was when they were releasing their new versions of their software, they would run across a package and say, where did this come from? Why is this in our software? And they go back to the development team and say, okay, who put this in? And they'd get crickets. And they'd say, how do you not know that who put this in? And what it was boiling down to was, I want a new feature, I add this package. Well, if I'm using npm or pip or something, it automatically is downloading all the other dependencies to this. So I know I put this package in, but I paid zero attention to all the dependencies that it pulled in with it, and all the little recursive dependencies going down.
And that's a lot.
And then
code.
they get to and then they get down to checking their code or trying to actually verify things, and they realize, where did this come from? What feature is it even tied to? Why is it in the program? So I do think people are struggling with trying to figure out how to wrangle, right? How do they get their arms around these things, and how do they actually even keep track of them? It's moving so fast that, and the developers, we all love developers, but I do it too. I install a package, and how often do I look at everything that it also installed that was a dependency underneath that?
You always look at that, don't you?
Always, every time, with a magnifying glass.
You read the license agreements on software too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, none of that copy left stuff, right? No. Right. So first of all, one, to just remind the audience, we got a lot of people in the audience. We are taking questions from you. Use the QA feature here. Feel free to, we're not going to wait till the end to take your questions. So if you got a question that's just buzzing in your head, throw it into the Q&A and we will answer it, or try to answer it. So there have been a few in the last few years. There have been a number of high-profile software supply chain compromises, both on the commercial software side and the open source side. Obviously, incidents like the SolarWinds compromise, 3CX on the open source side, the XZ utils. What lessons should we take from the postmortems of those incidents, the analyses of those, with regard to how threat modeling might have been used to prevent those from happening? How would threat modeling have empowered a 3CX, SolarWinds, what have you, to not be on the wrong end of those attacks? Chris, I'll throw that one to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so threat modeling of your build pipeline is another thing that I've recently just kind of unlocked in my own brain. The cases that you shared there, sure, XZ had its own social engineering kind of component to it.
Yeah.
But like if you, and I hate to talk about SolarWinds because it's so old, but their build pipeline was ultimately compromised. And we don't spend, nobody, once again, I'm going to say that like, I've never seen anybody threat model their build pipeline. But think of the value that comes out of that. Like that should be on your top 5 list of assets inside your organization. The build pipeline is creating the software, which is going to the customers, which is causing customers to send us money. And so it should ultimately be the thing that you're spending a lot of time analyzing, but nobody threat models the build pipeline itself, because think of all the components that go into it as well. You've got all of these you've got a whole suite of tools in 17 different categories that are in that build pipeline. You've got your source code control system. You've got, 1 to n number of developers with differing levels of access to it. You've got things like GitHub Actions. I was doing an interview with another speaker, and he was talking about the things they found in GitHub Actions, for example, like malicious GitHub Actions and things that can get snuck into those that just roar through the entire ecosystem in no time. And so I guess my big takeaway there is threat model those build pipelines, like use the threat modeling process to analyze the security of your build pipeline, identify a list of challenges, and then start figuring out how you're going to mitigate, how you're going to up your security and privacy game in the build pipeline itself.
Interesting. Knox, thoughts?
Yeah, I think Chris is absolutely right. What we have to do is, the problem is I think traditionally we think of our defense as a house, and this is not a house or a building. This is a process. And so you have to think about at each step, how am I in danger? At each step, where could something bad come into this process? And that's, as I go around and talk to people about like these attacks and what could happen, that's one of the big things I always point out is, look, it can happen anywhere in your supply chain. Absolutely shift left. Absolutely. But don't forget that after that, you've moved past those initial security processes early on. As that pipeline keeps going, every step of the way, there's something that could go wrong. And by the way, Chris, I know why they don't want people to look at that pipeline. It's because they've had to Frankenstein that thing together with all the different automation, and I mean, it's barely hanging together with a bash script in the middle, and they just don't want. They're like, it's working. That pipeline is working. Do not touch it. So that's part of the problem right there.
Famous words in engineering: don't touch it.
Yeah.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right?
Yeah.
Well, it is broke. It's holding together. The two pieces are broken, but they're stitched together in such a way that as long as you put no weight on it, it doesn't fall over.
And in all seriousness, because I've been there and I've seen it, the problem is those guys who've built that know that if people start poking holes at it, and when I say people, I mean other security professionals in their organization, they're going to scream at them about the way that they've built it. And so they actually kind of they don't really want it scrutinized. They don't really want to threat model it, because they know the second you start actually looking at it, you're going to see all kinds of things that are glaring and need to be fixed. And so that's something that has to be addressed, right? And it's the fear of, I don't have time to build this thing right. I just have to build it so it works. And we've got that mentality will get you.
Right. So throw another poll up, which is looking at, what people's perceptions of software supply chain risk are to their organization. So software supply chain attacks are an active threat to my organization, a concern for the future, but not an active threat, or not something that concerns us. Happily, nobody said it wasn't something that concerned them. Of course, a little bit of a self-selecting population here on this webinar. 70% said they considered it an active threat to their organization, 30% a future concern, not a top concern. I guess what would your message, Chris and Knox, be to them about, is this active? Is this a current threat you need to be worried about now? Or is this kind of, yeah, over the next 5 years, you want to pay more attention to this, but don't need to be on your toes about it right now?
Current, 100% current. Like we've got too much evidence of all of these events that have happened in the last couple of years. Every attacker on earth understands build pipelines and the goodies that they can get from it, including nation states. And so I would say everybody should be moving now towards increasing the security of your build pipelines, your secure software supply chain program, the tooling, everything you're using to do this, because if you're starting now, you're already behind. And when nation states sniff out potential threats and potential scenarios, they have lots of resources to drive through those things. It's not a kid in somebody's basement somewhere in a sweatshirt, right? This is nation state actors with buildings and buildings filled with college educated computer science, cybersecurity master's degree people who are able to break things very consistently.
And to be clear, we're talking on both the software producer and the software consumer side. This is something that both organizations. So obviously, if you're making and distributing software to tens of thousands of companies, yes, you're a target. But then also, as we've seen on just the enterprise side, downloading and deploying software, you are also at risk of software supply chain attacks through your suppliers. So help our audience, and again, I would remind the audience, we're taking questions. Don't be afraid to use the QA feature if you got something question you want answered. We're happy to hear it. Help us understand, because many companies, probably most of the folks on this webinar, are working in organizations that have invested heavily in application security testing technologies over the last 2 decades, SAST, DAST, software composition analysis and other tooling. Do those play a part in threat modeling for software supply chain security? Are they adequate to build do threat modeling for software supply chain security? What role do those existing investments in application security testing play?
So those are technologies / tools which provide different benefits than threat modeling. So SAST, we're scanning code and we're looking for identified issues for a particular line number. So a coding error that could result in a vulnerability. SCA, I think, is another table stakes piece of technology at this point. Like, it's easy enough to scan for the libraries you're using and see what might be found there, right? I'm also not a fan of DAST, and so it's hard for me to even describe about the value of DAST, because
dynamic
I think
application security testing, right?
Yeah, the modern instances of those tools just don't provide a lot of positive return on investment as far as the output that comes out of them. But all of that to say, if I come back around, threat modeling is this way of thinking about what are the potential challenges that could exist in something that we're building in the early stages. SAST, I need code. I can't run SAST on an idea. I can only run it on code. It doesn't have to be running code. But and then when I think about SCA, I also have an application that has a manifest file that can be checked and compared there. And DAST is running against the running version of the application. So threat modeling is complementary to all of these different technologies in general, whether it's for the software supply chain or just in any instance, it's complementary. But they are a defense in depth strategy for securing the things that you're creating, you're building. I wouldn't recommend picking 1 out of 4 of that list and just trying to use that. Like, we need to stack these things together so we have the best chance of catching anything that could come in.
You've got to understand that it can happen at any point in your pipeline, and you got to think about everything from they're already inside my environment to do I have an insider threat to just what are my unknowns, right? What do I not know about? I mean, until that software actually leaves your repository and goes out into the wild, you've got to keep checking it, because if the bad guys, like we've seen in some of these attacks, the bad guys will sit in the environment and look for the weak spot in your pipeline.
Sure.
And that's the spot they're going to attack, and they'll do it when you're least expecting it, and like SolarWinds on Christmas, and they'll right when the time is right, spring the trap. But you've got to make sure that you're checking every single point of that pipeline for all of those different things. And the only thing that is going to do that is some threat modeling and some brain power and some thought into what could happen at this step. But you can't just I think that's the thing. You have to have these tools. The tools have to be there at every step, but you can't neglect any of them. You've got to make sure that you're checking your whole pipeline out.
Okay, we've got a bunch of questions that have come in. Thank you very much. I'm going to get to those in a second. One, I think, important question to ask just is a critical one for organizations, which is who owns this within the organization, both on the producer side and the end user organization side. Threat modeling sounds like belongs to the development team, if you're a software producer, and then I'm guessing the security team on the end user organization side. I mean, where should this responsibility reside? Who should be the point of the spear on this within both a producer and consumer organization? Chris, I'll
the way,
that one.
yeah, the way you set that up, I would say, is where we want to get to in the future. So I'm somebody who firmly believes the way we do threat modeling at scale is via the development team, because we know we don't have enough security professionals on the security team. I mean, every year BSIM does the survey, and it's somewhere between 100 and 150 to 1 ratio of developer to security people. That's not going to change.
Yep.
We're not going to have 500-person security teams for 5,000 developers or something. It's not going to happen. So we need this to happen with the development teams. What I'm seeing as the last couple of years at Devici, as I've talked to a lot of different companies out there, is that most people are either not doing threat modeling, and they're interested. They're like, we want to do it, we just have no idea how to make this a reality. They're doing it with consultants, or they're doing it with their security champions. It's the best case scenario. I haven't seen anybody yet who's doing it at scale with their developers. And I actually wrote an ebook that's going to come out here in the next couple of weeks on this journey, what I just described there, because it's the result of me. I would have told you 2 years ago, oh, there's people that are doing this with all the developers. And I'm like, I start talking to more and more people. I'm like, nobody's doing this. And so I wrote this book to kind of show you how you can progress through those stages with the goal of getting to that point where developers are doing it. But I would agree with you, Paul, that the security team is likely on the consumer side are the ones that are driving any threat modeling that's occurring if you are not producing software.
Knox, any thoughts on that?
No, I absolutely agree. I think the problem is again, developers tend to kind of fall into that same category with the guys on the pipeline, right? I'm trying to get this thing working, and if it's working, I don't want to touch it. And also, I do think that there's a really I've heard the argument, right? Like I'm going to jump into this question that we've been asked over here about how do you start teaching your developers. The problem is you'll get pushback. You try to spend some time teaching your developers about security, and you'll have powers that be say, well, that's not what they do. They do development. They don't do security. And you'll have developers who say the same thing, like, right, like I develop, I don't do that. It is short-sighted to say that. They've got to be involved in the process to some point, and they have to learn. And I have found that most of the time they just don't know what they don't know. And there's been many times when I was a platform engineer, I would point out to them and say, hey, look, that thing that you just did there, what if I try to use that against you? And then I show them, like, look, I could do this. And look, I just got the secret that you put in there. I just stole it right out from under you because you just left it in this place. And they once their eyes are open, they're like, oh, I never even thought about somebody using it that way. And then they change it. But a lot of them just don't even think about it. So I think there's a It's just the whole thing is very difficult. You have to, as an organization, get to a cultural point to where security is a positive thing culturally, and you're celebrated if you're pointing these things out and fixing them. And there has to be just a balance between, like, look, guys, you got to think about these things, and we're going to help you, and we're not going to yell at you. And there's a culture that has to develop around all of it.
I call this the light bulb moment, because I've taught threat modeling a bunch of different times in different forums. And you'll have that moment where somebody who may have been a naysayer in the early portions of the workshop or class, and all of a sudden it hits them. They're like, oh, I see it now. I get it. So, and the best ones are when they're like, hey, I got to go back to my desk for a while. Oh, why? Because I got a big problem that I got to go solve. So when I think about teaching threat modeling, though, for me, it's often been grassroots approaches. Like, I would love to come into an organization and get the support where it comes mandated that we're going to do this. I just haven't seen that happen very much. So that's why security champions are really a way. If you have people that are stepping up, raising their hand and saying, hey, I want to be a champion, they already have a little passion for security. So teach them and pour into them how to do threat modeling, and let them take it to their Scrum teams, for example. Let them be the threat modeling person on the Scrum team, and get some other people. It's about getting momentum is really the best success that I've had. If you can get it to be approved from executive management that it's going to happen, I just haven't seen that happen yet. Any size organization.
Is that just an awareness problem?
At the end of the day, it's a resource problem. It's a return on investment problem. It's a customer demand for features, right? And that's something I'm very clear whenever I teach threat modeling and talk about this. Like, there is always a tension between what the business needs and what security needs. And security can't win. Threat modeling can't push its way into what the business needs, because then we don't have a business anymore. Nobody's buying a product that doesn't have any new features added to it because we're spending all this time on security. Like, you have to find that happy medium where we're moving security forward, but we're still serving the needs of the business. And I think a lot of it is just that it's a lack of understanding at the executive level. But I mean, I've been around security for almost 28 years at this point. Like, I remember when we had to argue just for people to listen to us, and people would say, go away. I don't want to do that. Go away. And they could do it. They can't do that anymore. But we haven't gone to that next level where they've embraced something like where executive management is saying, and the board is saying, threat modeling is the thing you have to do to ensure we minimize our overall risk for the organization. There's another phase we have to go through, probably a couple steps in a couple phases we have to get through, where before the board and executive teams will be like, okay, this is what we're doing.
Yeah. I do feel like it's starting to change. You're starting to see, stories, whether it's at state level or federal level, of kind of raising the bar on what is expected of software companies. And obviously for the board or the executive suite, that could change the calculus of whether to make an investment or not. But I see your skepticism, and I don't disagree.
Well, they're primarily driven by, like, the executive order mentions threat modeling from a number of years ago, but that only applies to those who provide goods and services to the federal government, U.S. federal government, right? So that's 90% of tech does either they provide things to the government and they do it in such a way that it's like in a different venture or something, so it's not under those. But like that doesn't move the needle. Like the whole CISA secure by design thing. Like, I'm a big fan of what they're trying to do. The problem is they're not talking to the right people. They're not moving things in the right direction. They're treating this as a big awareness play. Like, we just need to tell everybody about it and they'll do the right thing. No, it has to come back to a business justification, a business need, business priority, and it has to make them more money. If it makes them more money, everybody will do it.
Right. Or it doesn't cost them money that will affect their, bottom line, right? I mean, that's the other thing. That is the sort of stick approach, right? Is might not necessarily sell more products, but you're going to avoid some really steep fines that are going to affect your bottom line. Okay, so Julia threw into the chat, I worry about the open source that is not part of our applications, packages that don't fall in a category of application code, such as developer IDE plugins, VS Code extensions, PowerShell, PS Gallery modules, open source development tools that get deployed for someone's convenience into production infrastructure, extensions for Azure DevOps, similar to your GitHub Actions example. So is she right to be concerned about that? And
Yes.
you know what?
Yes.
What should you do as a development team, as a development organization, to address those risks, seeing as that's pretty ingrained in the way that modern developers act within an environment, and what they're building their suite of tools and to help them do their job. So how do you address the legitimate cyber risks in those without messing up their productivity?
Well, I'll jump in because I've lived this. The first thing you have to do is the most basic, which is you have to have policies around it. Okay, whether they follow them or not, that's going to be later on down. But there has to be a set policy that's known about how you're going to handle, especially when we're talking about like VS Code or JetBrains, like those kind of plugins, because bad guys know that the developers are looking for tools to help them, and they don't realize that they could get a tool that's basically legitimate and it just harvested all their creds off their machine or something, right? So first of all, policy. What's your policy on it? Secondly, are you going to say that if you use a plugin, it needs to be vetted, that you're going to have a process, that you're going to make sure it gets checked before it's allowed on the machine? Are you going to tell developers that they have to develop on the company machine? They can't develop on their own machine? That's another really big factor, because a lot of places don't even think about that. They just, like me in this bunker, they just let me build on whatever I want, right? So you've got to start thinking about those things and setting rules, and then making sure that your developers are following those, and training, same thing we've been talking about, make sure that they are aware and their eyes are open to the fact that just because this tool looks like it'll really help you, no, it is actually a compromised plugin that you just allowed somebody to execute, because that plugin has the ability to execute code. It has the ability to look at probably the entire repo that they have in there. So it's a big deal. You've got to make sure that you have some kind of protocols around how you're going to allow your developers to develop and to push the code back up into the repo.
And I would just tell Julia, I agree. I'm concerned about it too. It's a big problem, right? Because I've seen some large enterprises where you can't add a plugin unless it goes through a formal approval process. That's why in previous startups, I didn't build plugins, because of the large enterprises I was searching for. I knew it would take 18 months to get the plugin approved, if it ever got approved. But I realized in mid to smaller organizations, they're more free with giving developers the ability to build, using whatever tools they want. And so I agree with Knox on this, though. Like, you need some policies and stuff in place. Like, you can't just this can't be the Wild West of development anymore, where you just use whatever you want. It's this, bring your own machine. No, not anymore. Like, developers should be working on a company-owned asset that's secured, that is encrypted. Like, these are all things that feel like they should be table stakes at this point in the game, but unfortunately, they're not.
But they're not.
And is an approach maybe an approved list of plugins, modules, and stuff like that? These we vetted and feel comfortable with. Outside of this, we want to assess them before we give you permission.
And I would go farther and say, lock it down. These things should be locked down in such a way that you can add things, which is what I've seen in those large enterprises. Developers, it's not like they could bypass the process. They had VS Code locked down somewhere that they couldn't add stuff without it being on an approved list.
So there are a number of threat modeling frameworks that are out there. There's Stride, there's Pasta, Thread. How do those scale to address software supply chain? Are they applicable to software supply chain security threat modeling, or no, not so much?
So first of all, just to get on the record here, Dread is dead. People always bring it back. It's been dead since like the early 2000s, but it's one of those ones that keeps getting tossed back around. I would say like Stride is not aimed at, Stride is very basic. Stride is a teaching tool
For
for teaching.
smaller organizations, basically.
No, not even that. It's a teaching tool so that people can learn how to threat model. Because one of the biggest challenges with teaching someone to threat model is I say, okay, draw a picture of what you're building. They can do that, no problem. They understand what they're building and all the intersections of it and how to describe it. And then I say, okay, what can go wrong with that? And they're like, I don't know. I have no idea. So what Stride gives you is a mnemonic of spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privilege. It gives you a set of threats that you can then begin with as a launching point. Now, if you're using Stride 5 years in the future, you've missed what it exists for. It exists as a launch point so that you understand foundationally how to apply a series of threats to something that you're building. And then once you get more savvy with it, then you can start looking at things like MITRE's ATT&CK. Yeah, it's very red teamy kind of breaking stuff focused, but you can extract some ideas out of that of things that could go wrong in what you're building. And so think of Stride as kind of this launch point from an education perspective. So it's going to apply the same way to the software supply chain. Now, you noticed in that list of items that are in Stride, none of those are supply chain specific. There is no mnemonic. There is no set list of threats that are specific to supply chain. There's the top 10 OWASP CI/CD risks. It's a few years old now. It's getting a little dusty. I wish they would dust it off and come out with a refreshed version. So we really do need a top 10 list of software supply chain issues. I've seen people write their own versions of it. I haven't seen anybody come together and say, this is like an OWASP document, for example, that everybody could pour input into and then we can agree on. But that would be the real launching point to threat modeling software supply chain, would be taking a document like that and then applying it to your software supply chain.
Interesting. Okay. Knox, any thoughts on that, on applying frameworks to this, or how to build out your framework for doing software supply chain, I guess is a better way to frame it.
I do think the industry as a whole needs to think about that. And I think the thing that's been holding us back is everything is so diverse, right? Everybody's build process is different. Am I building with JavaScript and building a React application? Am I building with Java and I'm building a semi-compiled Java application? Am I building a C binary that's going to run on Windows, right? Like, I think that's part of the problem, is that there's such a diverse, what am I trying to say? Just large group of things that can go wrong and that can be used for development. We need to try to figure out how to abstract and find the common elements across all of them, and then start trying to prescribe some best practices around how you're watching all these different areas. And I think it's really funny, right? We've had this evolution. We went into DevOps, like into Agile. And then we decided, hey, we're going to have Agile now. So now we need to watch security somehow in here. And then we said, oh, we're going to have like teams rotate who's watching security. And now I feel like we had DevSecOps. We're like, well, we're just going to push it over to the DevOps team and have them watch it. And they said no. So I feel like that's gone. And then now we have AppSec, actual people with the title AppSec, which is good. But my point is just that this is just in the last 5 years, I feel like, what I'm describing, or 8 years. And so we're seeing this continual, it's like we're throwing mud at the wall trying to see which way is going to work best. Right now, we've landed on, okay, we've got to have an AppSec person. All right, now what's the rule, right? Is it the 2 pizza rule? 1 AppSec person for every team? One, I mean, what is it? Is it, and again, then you run into the same problem. The pipeline has so many different elements in it. The AppSec person can't watch them all because they only know AppSec. They don't know CloudSec. They don't know, whatever other thing that's going on in that pipeline. So it's an evolution right now, and I agree. We've got to get our brains wrapped around it.
And so, Paul, before we go on, Magno mentioned salsa.dev,
Oh yeah,
slsa.dev has a great list of software supply chain threats. I had forgotten about this
yeah.
resource. And since the last time I looked at it, they've bolstered it. It's a real, I'm just scanning it right now while we've been talking here. And it is a solid list of
It's the
threats that people
closest thing
should
we have.
consider.
Salsa is definitely the closest thing we have right now to articulating where things happen along the pipeline and what can happen. And I would say that's the closest framework we've got right now.
And just practically, you could take a look at that list and again, it's in the chat if you want to grab it, but as a way to help you understand, what risks you need to be attuned to and like what you should be, on the look for as a development organization. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah. I mean, I'll give you an example of one.
Yeah.
Here's one I'm just looking off the screen. An adversary builds from a version of the source code that does not match the official source control repository. So that's
Right.
one of the threats that they have in this catalog, which is, and then they have 6 or 5 different conditions built from unofficial fork of code, built from unofficial branch, or unofficial build steps. They have all these other kind of derivatives of it too, with mitigations attached. So my recommendation is for folks that are in this webinar, I just posted the link to the actual threat page. I was kind of digging in it as we continue to talk here. Go take a look at this. This is good stuff. Like I'm gonna reread this after we hang up in this webinar.
Final poll question here. Are you using threat modeling for application security? And the results, take a look. 60% yes, 40% no. Does that sound about right to you, Chris?
Actually, I mean, I think we have a controlled group of folks who kind of came to a talk with threat modeling in the name. It seems I would say it's higher than what I see across industry, but
right.
For those other 40% and even for the 60%, check out Devici, check out what we do. We'll help you close the gap.
Okay, coming up near the end here, got about 5 minutes left. So one thing we talk about a lot here at ReversingLabs is applying complex binary analysis as a way to kind of level up your software supply chain security. Knox, I think I'd just throw it to you to just talk a little bit about, and Chris, interested in your thoughts as well, about how kind of that capability of peering into black box commercial binaries can help companies address this, again, growing issue of software supply chain risk.
Yeah, especially we're talking about the third party supply risk. We want to talk about the idea that you can't just, we've already hinted around it, right? You can't just grab a piece of software from a vendor, trust the vendor, and just deploy it to 2,000 machines in your environment. You can't do that. You might be great friends with that salesperson and you had a beer and you really get along, but that's not the point. You've got to take that piece of software, and before it goes into the environment, you need to do your own testing and your own scanning of that piece of software to make sure that you know what is in it and what you're putting into your environment, what behaviors it has, what it is, what it's able to do, the permissions it has in it. I think people don't realize, they think, oh, I've got an SBOM and I can see the CVEs. Yeah, but do you know what behavior is inside that software? Do you know whether that software has the capability of altering registry keys, altering a file system? Can it change anything with the user? You don't know those things from just an SBOM or from just a CVE list. So those are the kind of things that we're going to give you when you scan with Spectra Sure.
Right?
Yeah. Are there exposed credentials? Are there things inside there? So then you're able to compare the results against the risk appetite of your organization, and you can decide if you're going to deploy this piece of software or not. And I was really happy to see just this last week, Paul, we got a report from, we have a new feature that we've just implemented in the last couple of months called the Safe Report, where we allow the user to be able to send the report to somebody else. So they scan the piece of software, you get a full report, and now you can get a link, and it's self-destructing link. And you can send it back to the vendor. You can send it to somebody else in your organization. And we had a report of one of our customers sending the report back to a vendor, and the vendor made the change that the customer requested because they saw something. And not only that, I heard they're talking to us now too. So that the producers actually want to know more about us and implementing us into their process. So you've got to be vigilant, right, about this. You can't just trust a vendor. You can't just trust a piece of software you get. If you get popped and you're standing in front of a judge or whatever, right, you're as a company, saying I trusted the vendor is probably not going to stand up. I have a feeling they're probably going to say you need to do your own. You should have done your own, due diligence before you deployed this thing.
Mm-hmm.
We know that based on SEC actions within the last week that if you're the victim of a supply chain attack, that is not going to absolve you of legal responsibility. And so, I mean, if you're a publicly traded company, you need to be concerned about it. I think I'm getting a hint here that we need to.
I see we're running out of time. I want to make sure we get these last couple things in here.
Yes, sorry. Really great conversation, everybody, and thank you so much for your questions. We've got more of this coming up, more great content here from the folks at ReversingLabs. We have a Halloween themed one this week on Halloween, October 31st is your software supply chain, a haunted house. We also have early November, the M elephant in the room. Obviously, it's talking about machine learning and AI-based risk, detecting machine learning-based malware. And then lots of stuff on demand if you go to our website and check out the webinar sector. Lots of great conversations. This will eventually be on demand as well, if you want to share it around. So any closing thoughts, Chris and Josh? Chris, I'll start with you.
I would say threat model the software supply chain. Let's extend this concept deeper than we ever have on the AppSec front, and let's make it part of the software supply chain. And I'll just point out I do a couple of podcasts and I have a newsletter too. So if you want to
subscribe,
hear from me more and subscribe, and then also check out Devici.com for information on our threat modeling platform.
Final words, Knox?
Be safe out there, right? You've got to think about it. You can't just hope. You can't hope and pray. You've got to do your due diligence, and you've got to be thinking about what could go wrong. And you've got to think about all those aspects. What could go wrong? Where's the insider threat? What's the thing I'm not thinking about? Talk to people, get together, have an exercise, right? You've got to take care of yourself out there.
And I think I think one of the things is, with greater transparency, with the ability for end user organizations to peer into binaries and identify threats, there will be more pressure upstream on software producers to do the right thing, be transparent, and be held accountable. So change is happening, and better to be ready for it than to be caught unprepared, I'd say. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you everyone for coming. Check us out on social media. My name is Paul Roberts. Josh, Chris, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure doing this, and we'll get together and do another one of these. Okay.
All right.
Sounds good.
Thank you guys.
All right. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Bye.